Good evening, everyone. It's an honour and a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. And as I start, I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we're gathering tonight, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And particularly to Auntie Violet, what a wonderful welcome to country. She brought it to life. She brought to life the importance of healing and partnership. And I really hope her son Kevin pursues his interest in science. Today and tonight has already made me I'm an optimistic person, but I feel even more optimistic about the future. And we've just been talking at our table about the calibre of the 100 applicants for the Marie Krogh Young Women in Science Award. And just listening to the ones that we've heard about so far, you sort of listen and go, yeah, well, that's going to win. And then you listen to the next one, that's going to win. And we've all been talking about how incredibly inspiring, but across so many different areas of science, and what amazing, amazing young women these are. So I'd like to thank the organisers at Novo Nordisk for including me and inviting me to be part of this special occasion, and really to try to bring to life for you some of my experiences as a clinician scientist who also happens to be a woman, and to also, I think, honour the life and legacy of Dr. Marie Krogh. Now, we've heard a bit about her tonight. It's wonderful hearing from the author of the biographer. She really brought to life, I think, also the love affair between Marie and August, which I thought was really wonderful. I read a bit about them, and, just to recap the important facts, Marie was a pioneering Danish physician. She was the fourth woman in Denmark to earn a higher degree, a doctorate in medicine, and that was in 1914. Marie collaborated closely with her husband August, but it was really interesting to see that they had separate laboratories. And I bet Marie's was a lot tidier than August's. And that August won the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1920. The other thing I read about them is that there was apparently very strong schools of thought around respiratory physiology in Denmark at the time, and there were alternate schools with August and Marie on one side and the other guys who lost out in the end on the other. And it was really, what a remarkable partnership, and to hear about their life. And we've also heard, importantly, that during their lifelong personal and professional partnership, Marie and August developed one of the earliest insulin treatments for diabetes, which is amazing. Marie herself had diabetes, and they travelled the world, worked with scientists overseas, and, as we've heard, have laid the foundations for Novo Nordisk as we know it today. So that's a story of transformation, of partnership, of collaboration. But to be able to change what was a once fatal condition, diabetes, into a manageable disease is quite amongst, and that was just one of the things they did. Really, really incredible. But Marie's story goes far beyond scientific achievement. Marie and August had 4 children. She worked full-time as a clinician and was one of Denmark's most prominent scientists of her time, a true multitasker. She regarded science as a means to resolve the real-world problems that she encountered, which to me is why being a clinician scientist is so much fun and has so much meaning to so many of us. Women like Marie Krogh worked in an era where their contributions were often invisible, but they persisted. And it's wonderful to see, her legacy and this recognition, over 100 years later. Her name may not be widely known outside Denmark, but Novo Nordisk is changing that. But Marie paved the way for women today whose discoveries are transforming lives around the world, like our young finalists tonight. Supporting the next generation of women in science is something that's very close to my heart. And it's not just about the words fairness and equity. It's about excellence. It's about recognising that diversity in our leadership drives the kind of innovation that truly changes health outcomes, but also truly changes our society. And to me, that's incredibly exciting, and it's a real privilege to stand here honouring our future leaders who are going to carry that torch forward. So I'm going to share a little of my own journey as a clinician scientist, just to reflect on how we can create a future where every young woman has the opportunity to thrive in science. And again, I'm really quite optimistic with where we are now. I think my philosophy is always, if you see something that is wrong or is unfair, you call it out. And you've got to be a bit brave and bold to do that. But I think we have a society now, and I can certainly speak for Australia, where we do stand up and call things out if we don't think that they are right. We are all shaped by our history. And my mum grew up in the Great Depression. She was a brilliant scholar, she was top of her class, but her dad died young and her mum was a widow, and she had to leave school early to help support her family and so that a younger brother could finish school. And he was hopeless at school. Mum had to stop working when she got married. She became passionate about her daughters having the opportunity for education. That was just, education was top of the pops in our household. So I grew up oblivious to gender inequity in Newcastle, New South Wales. I went to an all-girls school where we were taught that girls can do anything. I entered medical school in the 1980s in the University of Sydney, and the medical intake was about 50-50 at that time. So, you know, was I blessed? Or, you know, that was growing up in the 70s and the 80s. I went into undergraduate medicine straight out of school, and by the end of the third year, I must say I was flagging through the weight of just studying and studying all the time. My mum, as I said, herself a widow now, just would have killed me if I'd taken a year off, and there wasn't such thing as a gap year at that time. So instead, I took a year out and did a research year, a BSc Med, during my medical degree. I was fascinated by birth defects and did studies really looking at the effect of thalidomide. And I was hooked. I loved the autonomy that I could work really, really hard and then I could take breaks, but I could focus on things I was passionate about. And that's, I think, the essence that I always say when I'm giving talks with wise advice for young people, is pursue what fascinates you, because that's never work. It's just something that you're passionate about. When I went back into medical school, into my fourth year, that was the year that I did paediatrics, and I loved it immediately. I loved being able to cuddle my patients, but I also was quite dazzled by some of the physicians I saw. And my first mentor was a paediatric neurologist called Robert Ouvrier. He was very funny, and at lunchtime they'd give teaching sessions, and Robert had this amazing talent. He could do ventriloquism with a Donald Duck voice. And so he'd sit there and he'd bring in a little uncooperative 3-year-old and he'd throw his voice around the room and meanwhile do this amazing neurological examination because the child was just entertained, and he could then elicit these amazing signs. And I thought, as I think every person should think around what they want to do, they should look at people and think, that's what I want to be when I grow up. He was a man with an amazing work ethic. He was a full-time clinician and head of department, but I'd say he was also a prolific scientist, and he wrote the book, literally, on inherited peripheral nerve disorders. He was curious, he had an amazing generosity of spirit, he had a great sense of humour, and so I, decided to enter paediatrics. I did my option term with him, and it was the beginning of what is a relationship that still continues today. So I started paediatric training, and you have to do basic training, but I must say I always did some research in the background, because as you know, when you're an intern, you're sort of at the bottom of the pile, and having something that was mine and that was captured my interest was always important to me. Paediatrics is a great work environment. It has a gender balance, and I'm not sure if that's because, well, why do I think that is? I think it's because if you're attracted to working with children, it excludes all people with arrogance, because kids just don't tolerate that. And it's sort of, there is this equilibrium that you have to relate to children and you have to care about their parents. And I think, you know, that also eliminates people that are just self-interested and want to walk over other people. So, as I said, here I am, you know, I'm in my 20s now doing paediatrics, and I still haven't had bad experience around gender balance, or, you know, I still believe, actually I still do, that girls can do anything. My first inkling of gender inequity came after I was halfway through paediatrics training, the end of basic training, and I'd done my exam and I'd passed it, a physician's exam. And so I went to my mentor, Robert Ouvrier, who, you know, I knew very well, and my husband and I had him over for dinner with his wife, and, you know, it's a great relationship. And when I passed the exam, I went to his office and I went, okay, Robert, I now want to do paediatric neurology. I want to subspecialise and train. And the first thing he said to me was, but Kathy, what about marriage and children? And I paused and I said, oh my God. Oh my God, I did all these years of medicine. I've pursued advanced training as a physician, and I've forgotten about marriage and children. And he looked at me and he went, you're just telling me to mind my own business and shut up, aren't you? And I went, so anyway, I trained in paediatric neurology. And, but I never will forget the shock of that being the first response to my mentor, with me having passed my exam, coming in and going, right, let's get on to the next bit. So doing neurology training in the 1990s, it was a very descriptive specialty. It was a bit like doing a cryptic crossword to work out diagnoses. But in the many cases, some of them heartbreaking, the parents had this question of, what's wrong with my child? Why has this happened? What can I expect? Is there a risk to my other children? What can I expect for the future, and what can you do about it? And because we didn't have very specific diagnoses at that time, we couldn't answer those questions, because many of these diseases were genetic in origin. And just to put that into perspective, epilepsy was not known to be a genetic disorder when I trained in neurology, and I'm not that old. And we now know over 1,200 genes for epilepsy. So because I could see that the only way we were going to really solve these problems was to actually start to look at genetics, I decided that I'd also subspecialise in that area. I did a doctorate while I was still in Sydney on an inherited genetic disorder called neurofibromatosis type 1. And the reason that came to fame in the late 1980s because the Elephant Man was misdiagnosed as having an F1. But anyway, I thought it was fascinating, just like I'd already done all this stuff on birth defects. You know, still to this day, I run research in neurofibromatosis. But I had developed a pen pal at Boston Children's Hospital who was an expert in neurofibromatosis. And when I was going around the US, I was actually interviewing for neurology jobs because once you've trained in Australia at that time, you do what we called the BOSCB, which is you've been overseas and then you came back. And when I went and I interviewed in neurology jobs in Boston, and then met with this guy who was my pen pal in neurofibromatosis. And after about half an hour, he said to me, why are you coming here to do neurology? You've done neurology. Why don't you think about doing genetics? Because he was both a neurologist and a geneticist. And I went, oh, I hadn't really quite thought about that. So we organised interviews that afternoon, and they interviewed me, and then I got offered that job, which obviously I took because I'm doing genomics still. And when my time in Boston was, again, two great mentors, Bruce Korf, who was the NF guy, the clinical geneticist and neurologist, and Lou Kunkel, who discovered one of the first major genes for dystrophin, which is the cause of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That was back in 1987, and we're talking about a time before the Human Genome Project was done. And that was a 13-year project that went from 1990 to 2003, where it took 13 years and cost $3 billion to sequence the first human genome. What is a genome? We have genes. Each gene is a recipe for a protein in your body. We have about 20,000 of them that make us who we are, that we inherit from our parents. The genome is all 20,000 of those genes, plus all the information in between that regulates it. And so 13 years, $3 billion, remember that. So these were great people that, and again, it was an environment that was, you know, there was a floor full of people working on the same genetic disorders I was. These mentors modelled curiosity, generosity, and collaboration, which are recurring themes that I'll always come back to. And it was an environment that nurtured the next generation of researchers who are the international leaders today. They let me design my own training program because I had duality of subspecialties. And they sent me to a course that was in a place in Bar Harbor up in Maine, the Jackson Laboratories that still today provide all the major animal models for genetic disease. And we do clinics in the afternoon where we'd sometimes look at animal models, patients would come in. But one afternoon we did a computer clinic and they demonstrated to us this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web that they just invented, which they thought might be useful in genetics one day. So as I was completing my postdoctoral training in Boston, Robert Ouvrier, back in Sydney, who I'd since forgiven, faxed me, that ages me as well, sent me a fax that was advertising the first clinical scientist fellowship at the Children's Hospital in Sydney. And I applied and I got it. And when I came back, the Children's Hospital in Sydney had moved from where it was in Camperdown out to where it is now in Westmead. And it had a brand spanking new research building. And I was one of only 10 researchers in this brand new hospital site. Research was not an integral part of that hospital system. It was a culture shock after being in Boston, where I was surrounded by people working on the same intricate things that I was. And I felt very isolated as a young clinician scientist, trying to set up my own lab where I felt really comfortable with clinical work. I often felt like an imposter because I didn't have the intense scientific training that non-clinician scientists had. And obviously I got through this difficult time, but I'm going to come back to that experience because it's stuck with me and a lot of my philosophy today. I carved my own path. I established the first paediatric neurogenetics clinic in Australia with a focus on NF1 and muscle disease, which is what I'd worked on in Boston. But it brought together, and this to me is a secret sauce, clinical practice, discovery research, looking at gene discovery, disease mechanism, then taking it into clinical trials to develop new therapies. And that, to me, is magic when you can bring it all together. And the clinician scientist, I think, is the backbone of so much of our research. The only real career path for clinician scientists at that time was within the university. So after I did my fellowship, I got a role at the Children's Hospital in the university department, which was advertised for a paediatrician with an interest in neurogenetics to complement the interests of the department. So should have had my name on it. So I took that job, and then I sort of rose through the ranks within the university and became the chair of paediatrics at the University of Sydney in my 40s. that was the real first time that I really struck gender imbalance or gender inequity. Because I moved from my, the lovely cocoon of the Children's Hospital with the wonderful gender balance in terms of our workplace. And as I became Associate Dean of Paediatrics and I was on the Dean's Advisory Committee, I would sit at this huge table and I was the only woman Associate Dean, and I was probably at least 10 years younger than anybody else around the table. It was quite intimidating, and I think that my pattern, as I've been reflecting back, and Padma and I were talking about this, is that if I saw inappropriate behaviour, I just call it out with what is a false bravado. I wasn't that, that brave and bold. But it was, just to give you examples, the previous dean sat down and sat at this big table because there's discussion of recruitment of a new dean. And he walked in and he said, "It's wonderful to be back with the men of medicine." And someone put up their hand and said, "Oh, we have Kathryn here." And I said, it's okay, I've got balls. And I debated whether to tell this anecdote, but I think it brings it to the fore. It's a little bit politically incorrect, but I was in the academic procession. So as professors in your university go in the academic procession, and I was positioned next to the Vice-Chancellor as we're walking along. And a lovely man, a mathematician, he looked at me and he went, "Well, this is novel, a woman professor in medicine." And I said, "If only I was an Indigenous lesbian amputee, we'd have all the minorities covered with my appointment." Now, that was out of character, but I think it made the point. So anyway, let's get back to science. Marie was famous for her meticulous approach. She even experimented on herself and her family members. I didn't go that far, but I think one thing I can relate to when I read about Marie is scientific stubbornness and tenacity is a very important part of being in science. And you've got to horizon scan and look for game changers. And the game changer, the one game changer I'm going to touch on was that Human Genome Project that I talked about that took 13 years and $3 billion. It really it was completed in 2003, but what we saw from that $13 billion was this amazing technology in terms of bioinformatics and sequencing technology. Think about the brick mobile phones we had back in the sort of early 90s to all of our slimline devices with your life on it that are sitting in your bags or on the table. Soon my team, and we're working a lot on gene discovery and particularly in muscle diseases, was using genomic sequencing in international partnerships to uncover the cause of severe muscle diseases. And it was mind-blowing to be able to solve puzzles that we'd worked on for years and years and years. Each puzzle was actually a family and a patient and their family who were desperate for answers. So it was an incredibly exciting time, and this was 2012, 2013. The speed of the adoption of a disruptive technology like genomics was related to how well it worked, how damn good it was, and the national and international collaboration and a spirit of trust and generosity, because we had to learn to share at a whole different scale, because the days of a single scientist sitting at their lab not sharing their data was completely gone. So in 2013, which is again around this time when we were this genomic revolution, that's when I moved to Melbourne to my current job as director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And the reason I was really attracted to this job was, one, it was established 40 years ago next year as a genetics institute initially. It was initially called the Murdoch Institute for Birth Defects, founded by Dame Elizabeth Murdoch and Professor David Danks, who was the grandfather of genetics in Australia. And it's since grown to really cover the gamut of solving the challenges that face children and their families. But because of this long history, and also because the Victorian Clinical Genetics Service is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Institute, which is Path to Research Translation, I was very, very tempted. And then when I came down and visited, I could see that the way the new hospital had been built, which was opened in 2011, was to integrate research within the hospital. So it was no longer the research building over there. You can walk out of the surgery, you can walk out of the wards, walk straight into the institute. And it's this wonderful clinicians and researchers working side by side to answer the major questions that we need to for our patients. Now, at this stage, it was very obvious that genomics was going to run into clinical practice very quickly. And so we did a series of consultations around the country to really look at how we could bring it all together in Australia, rather than duplicating our effort and fragmenting our genomics approaches. And the NHMRC brought all the experts around the country together, and they developed a targeted call for research called Preparing Australia for Genomic Medicine. Because all this stuff had happened in research, but the challenge was, how do you get this into practice? And how do you do that with equity of access to people around Australia? So I led the successful bid that formed Australian Genomics in 2016, which is a national network of over 100 institutions around the country, including all the clinical and pathology services. And it was really looking at how we also upskill a genomic workforce and how we take this into practice. So we started from what we had and we built up within the health system. Our goal was to show that genomic testing could provide faster, more accurate diagnoses for families. And our initial study looked at 100 patients with childhood syndromes, birth defects, that had a likely genetic diagnosis and standard of care in 2014, and showed that we had an 11% success rate of diagnosis at a cost per diagnosis of $24,000 based on the diagnostic workup that could include single gene testing. What we found is if we added in a genetic test at that stage of genomic sequencing, the diagnostic rate went from 11% to 55%. The cost per diagnosis went from $26,000 down to $6,000 per diagnosis. 5 times the diagnostic rate, a quarter of the cost. Medicare item. Took a few years to get Medicare item, but that is what happened. So that's, I'm not going to give you a lot of details about what we did in Australian genomics, but it's certainly been a wild ride in terms of riding the wave of a very fast-moving technology. The initial, remember it took, the first human genome took 13 years and $3 billion. We really wanted to see how quickly we could deliver tests, and it was sitting around 9 to 12 months initially. But now we can sequence an entire genome in less than 3 days for less than $1,000. So we now have genomics working in intensive cares, and we ran a study that involved every paediatric and newborn intensive care around the country, and we found we could diagnose just in first pass around over half of those children, and it changed their management of the most critically ill kids in 75% of cases. So this is the sort of way, to me it was a wonderful experience in demonstrating and also implementing a very disruptive technology. And I think that where it has ended is finally in July of this year, the government established Genomics Australia, which is basically based on the work and continuing that work in genomics, but where it should be embedded within government to really push along the change. So I think that looking forward, and just thinking of all of those experiences, to me, I think when you combined technology, trust, empathy, mentoring of the next generation, That's what really breeds success within research, and I think our future is exciting. We're entering an era where science can predict, prevent, personalise health across the entire lifespan. And we've heard those examples in hearing about the work of our Marie Krogh finalists today. The next great discoveries will come from teams that are interdisciplinary and inclusive. Teams, not individuals, because we need to combine expertise in biology, engineering, computation, and clinical practice. And many of the people who will lead the work are sitting in this room tonight. Your drive to become world experts in your specialist fields will help define what comes next. And like Marie Krogh, it's so important to be bold and curious and tenacious and to back yourselves. When I began my career, female professors in medicine could be counted on one hand. I was just thinking actually could be counted on one finger. But progress is possible, and we're seeing that progress today. The whole framing of our workforce, I think, has changed. But we're also all shaped by our experiences. And I did talk about when I came back from Boston to a big empty research building and how difficult that was. I really felt clinically depressed for about 12 months, thinking, what am I doing? Why don't I just go and do what I know, which is be a clinician? But it all worked out, obviously. But what that experience did to me, and I think all of our experiences do for us as individuals, is think, how can we make it better? And how can we make it better for the next generation? So for me, as I became established within that hospital, I would take under my wing all the new scientists or clinician scientists who came back from their BOSCB and were establishing their research programs so that they didn't have to experience that sense of isolation or being alone. And really that created an environment where people had a place to thrive and to become independent. And it grew into an incredibly successful research organisation with over 200 PhD students a year. The other thing I learnt to do is that clinician scientists are great and should be invested in. So what I would do is create fellowships in neurogenetics that were clinical, and they had to do a research project as part of it. And then my cunning plan was to addict the best people to research and lure them into a PhD so that they could then pursue a career as clinician scientists. And I think the Marie Krogh Prize is part of that same mission, supporting this next generation of women in science, rewarding them for their brilliance, but also supporting them to shape the discoveries of the future. So I think I've probably talked enough. I could obviously I could talk while I'm at time. Yep. I think I just wanted to end with a few reflections. And one is when I first became the director of MCRI, and in 2013. I was still in Sydney, and the head of comms rang me and he said, we want to promote you as the first female director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And my immediate response was, well, I'm the fourth director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and I happen to be a woman, so I don't think we should go with that, lead with that. Now, that was perhaps a bit churlish, but I think my philosophy is that true equity and diversity is not about regarding people as different based on, any of the gender, ethnic, whatever definitions. And I think that we should celebrate an environment where there is a lot of different people who are all treated equally and supported to do their best work. And that's been my goal as leader of MCRI. And my institute's about 2/3 of our staff are women. And we really make sure that we're supporting leadership into the future that really reflects our community. I was fascinated to learn that Marie started a medical practice to supplement her and August's fairly meagre academic income. It was a necessity of life that I'm sure will sound familiar to many clinician scientists today. And one of our programs I'm most proud of is our Clinician Scientist Fellowship Program, which, I've obviously, you can see where the ideas came from my experience. But it's been running now for 10 years, and we support 4 new fellows each year for 5 years, giving them 2 days a week. 2 days a week of protected research time. And now in its 10th year, it's supported over 40 clinician scientist fellows. The majority have remained research active, and research is now embedded in over 25 departments in the Royal Children's Hospital. So it's no longer us and them. They can't ignore research. And I would say that for me, mentorship's been one of the most joyful and sustaining parts of my career. To see your kids flourish, confident, capable, and leading with integrity is certainly the most rewarding part of what I do. So we've made enormous strides, and today I think we have a society that, despite all its weaknesses, is an environment where we are supporting people to speak up and for people to be heard. It's not perfect, but I think that it's so much better than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And if we all are thinking in the same way, it will become even better. We also need flexible career pathways that recognise the realities of family, caring responsibilities and career breaks. In Marie Krogh's Denmark of today, a newborn mother is entitled to 4 weeks leave before birth, and each parent is entitled to 24 weeks leave with parental benefits after birth, a total of 52 weeks parental leave. Excellent. So I think that my message to the young women in scientists here tonight is you have the best jobs in the world because you can pursue and you are pursuing your passions. It mightn't always be easy. You will fail at times, but it's absolutely worth it. I think that you don't need to have everything worked out. I personally review my life plan every 5 years or so because things change. And what matters most is your curiosity and backing yourself to pursue your passions. My motto is you can have it all, but just not all at once. And it's important, I think that goes for everybody in life. So as I close, I think again of Marie Krogh as clinician, scientist, a mother, an advocate. She didn't seek recognition. She followed the evidence, worked with integrity, and opened doors that others would walk through. Like Marie Krogh, we need to be bold, curious and determined, and we need to back ourselves. And the next chapter of discovery will be written by those who are prepared to ask big questions and tackle big problems and persist until they find the answers. So, on that note, thank you to Novo Nordisk for recognising why this award matters, and to the extraordinary finalists that we're celebrating tonight. And to all of you and all of us who continue to champion the critical role of women in science. Together we're shaping a future where talent, passion and discovery know no bounds. Thank you.